But then, in November 2006, the UN gave us a mandate to spread our combat forces around the rest of the country. And ISAF, that's the name of the International Security Agency there, developed a plan. This is the actual map from the ISAF plan to occupy the rest of Afghanistan. Stage 1, go north, our friends, the Northern Alliance. Stage 2, go to the west, more friends. Then in 2005, early 2006, what happens? We go to the south and the east. Those are the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan, the Badlands, if you would. And that's when we get an explosion of suicide terrorism in Afghanistan by Pashtuns against the military forces directly occupying them. Now, Pakistan. Where is Pakistan? Just on the other side of the border here. And who lives in the western parts of Pakistan? Pashtuns. It's the other half of the Pashtun homeland. And if I showed you the curves for suicide terrorism in Pakistan, you'd see a very similar pattern to Afghanistan with a 6-month lag. That is, there the spike up happens in 2007. And why? What happened there? As we were directly occupying this half of the Pashtun homeland in early 2006, we put pressure on Musharraf, then the president of Pakistan, to take 100,000 Pakistani army troops that were defending the country in the east against who's the #1 threat to Pakistan? India. You remember that we might think it should be the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, but in 2002, there was that little nuclear war they almost had that almost cost 30,000 dead Pakistanis. Okay, that's the #1 threat to Pakistan. And the Indian Army was defending Islamabad. If you ever look at the map, you'll see it's not a lot of distance there. Well, we put pressure on Musharraf to take 100,000 of those troops and put them on top of the other part of the Pashtun homeland. What was the result? Pashtun suicide terrorism there exploded. 3/4, not 100%, but 3/4 of all the suicide attacks in Pakistan have been directly against the Pakistani army in the western districts of Pakistan. And what happened to Musharraf? That's when his legitimacy plummeted. You see, when he did that, he put America's interests ahead of Pakistan's interests, and he lost support inside the country almost completely and just within a period of months. We saw that Musharraf was losing support, and what did we do? We decided we needed a backup. Benazir Bhutto, you might remember, she ran Pakistan in the 1990s. She had been living in London and been basically knocking on the White House's door for years, asking could she please go to Pakistan with the White House support. Well, we finally called her up and said, Ms. Bhutto, we need you. We want you to go to Pakistan because we're worried about Musharraf. Well, she gets there in fall of 2007. And in early October 2007, Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's #2, wrote her a letter. That letter said, we know you're an American agent. We know you're a backup to Musharraf. Leave or we will kill you. She didn't leave. 2 weeks later, she died in a suicide attack. They killed her. This is why also we have so many problems between now the United States and the Pakistani government. Notice how this has created a lot of problems. By militarizing, I call it indirect occupation of this part of Afghanistan, we're essentially breaking Pakistan apart. This is not a good thing. This is not a good thing. Now, what does this mean though for us here at home? So far I've been just talking about problems over there. To talk about how Al-Qaeda responds to these problems, I want to show you the most important recruitment video that Al-Qaeda has probably ever made for recruiting homegrown terrorists to kill us. It's made by Adam Gadon. Adam Gadon is an American. He was born in Riverside, California. He's about 34 years old. His name is Adam. His father was Jewish. When the family was young, the family converted to Christianity, and when Adam was a teenager, he converted to Islam. Since 1998, he's been living with Osama either in Afghanistan or now, we believe, in the western parts of Pakistan. This was his coming out video. The first time his face was ever shown, the big one, came out in 2006. As you're going to see, he's the poster child for recruiting homegrown terrorists to kill us. I just want you to listen to Adam's pitch.
It's crucial for Muslims to keep in mind that the Americans, the British, and the other members of the coalition of terror have intentionally targeted Muslim civilians and civilian targets, both before as well as after September 11th. In both the first and second Iraq wars, as well as in their forays into Somalia and the Sudan and Afghanistan, just to give you a few examples. And they've done this with the support and backing of their populations and electorates. I mean, even if there have been some feeble protests scattered here and there in the West, chiefly against the latest war in Iraq, all the same, the governments which started these wars have been re-elected by a majority of the popular vote. In their aggression against Afghanistan, which for Westerners and their mercenary sympathizers is the least controversial of Bush and Blair's terrorist wars, they have targeted civilians for assassination and kidnapping. They kidnapped any non-Afghans they found and shipped them off to Guantanamo or worse. Many were handed over to the American and British-backed despotic regimes of the Islamic world to be brutally interrogated. And with the blessing and support of that notorious Afghan killer, Hamid Karzai, they've murdered thousands of Afghan civilians as they slept in their beds, traveled on the roads, attended weddings, and prayed at their mosques. I know they've killed and maimed civilians in their strikes because I've seen it with my own eyes. My brothers have seen it. I've carried the victims in my arms. Women, children, toddlers, babies in their mother's wombs. You name it, they've probably bombed it. I could go on, and that's just Afghanistan. We haven't talked about American and British atrocities in the two Iraq wars. Let's take a look at the latest to be revealed. In Mahmoudiyah, 5 American soldiers gang rape an Iraqi woman, and then to hide the evidence, murder her and 3 members of her family and burn her body. And then, when our mujahideen take revenge on the unit which committed this outrage and capture and execute 2 of its members, they're called terrorists, and Muslims are supposed to disown them or face the consequences. And I'm not saying that we should go and slaughter their women and children one by one like they did ours at Haditha and Ishaqi and Mahmoudiyah and God knows where else. Even if some of our legal experts have permitted that. And even if it's hard to imagine that any compassionate person could see pictures, just pictures of what the Crusaders did to those children, and not want to go on a shooting spree at the Marines' housing facilities at Camp Pendleton. But what I am saying is that when we bomb their cities and civilians like they bomb ours, or destroy their infrastructure and means of transportation like they destroy ours, or kidnap their non-combatants like they kidnap ours, no sane Muslim should shed tears for them. And they should blame no one but themselves, because they're the ones who started this dirty war, and they're the ones who will end it, by ending their aggression against Islam and Muslims, by pulling out of our region, and by keeping their hands out of our affairs. And until and unless they do that, neither Forest Gate-style police raids, nor Belmarsh or Guantanamo prison cells, nor the mosques and the Imams Advisory Council will be able to prevent the Muslims from exacting revenge on behalf of their persecuted brothers and sisters.
So, no 72 virgins. Hardly any discussion of Islam as a religion. From beginning to end, this is an empathetic plea to respond to the plight of a kindred, yes Muslim, kindred population under a foreign occupation facing atrocities. This is also why our, quote, information war, our approach to this problem is going wrong. You're not going to stop this or confront this by explaining, having imams or anybody come up and say, the Quran does not support terrorism. He doesn't care. He's talking about a foreign occupation. This is what we're up against. The reality, if you notice, he has many facts here. He's like a good politician, spinning the facts. He's making the facts serve his purpose, but underneath it, also like a good politician, he's not making up the facts whole cloth. All those events he's talking about actually happened. In fact, he gives us no credit for policing ourselves, but those events did happen. This is what we need to confront. If we're going to actually stop suicide terrorism, we need to understand the actual motive of suicide terrorists, how the suicide terrorist organizations work on that motive, and then pursue policies that are directly relevant and don't make the problem worse. Now, what should those policies be? I don't think that we should simply walk away from the world. That is, cut and run or pursue some isolationist policies, because I think we have important interests and obligations overseas. Nor do I think that we should simply stay and die. That is, leave large numbers of ground forces in Muslim countries overseas, because that's producing more terrorists than it's killing. Instead, I argue for a middle ground new strategy called offshore balancing. Offshore balancing is a strategy, a military strategy, to secure our interests and obligations overseas. Offshore balancing is a strategy which, if we use military force at all, should not be onshore ground forces, but should be air and naval forces from afar, and if we needed onshore ground forces, just in and out very, very quickly. But mostly, offshore balancing is not a military strategy at all. It's mostly an economic strategy and political strategy to empower local groups on the ground as our allies. This is not a do-it-yourself unilateral strategy that's heavy on military power. This is rebalancing so that it's economic and political tools that are into the lead, working with local allies. And if we need military force only on the edges, we use it from offshore, as little military force as possible. This strategy of offshore balancing is actually not new. This is the strategy the United States pursued for decades in the Arabian Peninsula in the 1970s and 80s, where we successfully secured our interests and obligations there without stationing a single combat soldier on the Arabian Peninsula. This is the policy that allowed us to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. It's the policy we then diverted from. We went to onshore presence. That's where things went south. This is also the policy that we're seeing now in Iraq. The more we've moved to offshore balancing, I called for this in the first book in 2005. I said we should move to this over 3 or 4 years in Iraq, and now we're doing that. The more we've moved to offshore balancing, things are getting better and better and better. This is also the policy that allowed us to topple the Taliban in 2001. In the fall of 2001, the Taliban controlled 90% of Afghanistan. And what did we do? Did we send a 100,000-man army there? No. We sent 50 guys on the ground. We used mostly economic and political means to empower the Northern Alliance. Then, when we needed it, we used air power from offshore. And what happened? Within 6 weeks, the Northern Alliance kicked the Taliban completely out of the country, wrecked all of al-Qaeda's camps, and for years, Afghanistan was the good war because we had the policy of offshore balancing. Then what did we do? We shifted to the wrong policy of onshore military presence, and things went south. We should just go back to the right policy and cut the fuse to stop future suicide terrorism. Anyway, let me stop there and take your questions. Thank you so much.